Hello, I'm Walt Murray, and today we're going to talk about bringing validation into the 21st century. And as I travel and speak to various groups around the United States, it's really kind of amazing to me as I challenge the audience how much or how many people have actually made themselves aware of the new validation process, and by virtue of the 2011 guideline that the FDA has published. So today's going to center around understanding the importance of that process and a little bit about some details and takeaways that you can use as a result of this presentation. So let's set the stage, if we will. Okay, first, standards now relative to quality have become more explicit versus implicit in terms of the nature of the writ. So whether it's a guideline, a standard, or even in the case of regulation, the documentation has become a little bit more how-to, a little more suggestive, and definitely more explicit relative to the expectation. So an example is the use of a validation master plan as a recommendation. While this is not a requirement, it is important to recognize that it is something that is requested quite often in understanding the big picture around validation and organization. So process validation then officially became a process-driven approach by the FDA when the 2011 process validation guideline came out. That's 5 years since that has actually happened. And it's amazing to me as I query folks in general audiences in various venues for medical device, the struggle in people wanting to move away from the old to the new, and how important it is to understand the need for the new, because it is to our benefit. So we want to make sure, first of all, that we understand the importance of validation, process validation, as it relates to also understanding what do we mean by verification or fully verified versus validated. So let's clarify things a little bit, okay? First of all, we need to understand that having a non-verifiable condition has significant consequences in terms of compliance issues, in terms of warning letters during inspections or investigations, or even delays in submission of the means to approve a product and not having used some of the concepts that are in the new guideline. Field actions that result from poor application of the use of process validation in the design aspect of the product. And of course, one of the things that where the red flag goes up is when we start to see the analysis or trending of analysis around post-market surveillance issues, and the question as to why product is not valid in terms of its ability to be repeatable and reliable, in the sense that it has gone through a healthy dose of design validation. So the conservative approach that we're very familiar with, or the old IQ, OQ, PQ, is very costly. There's kind of a never-ending condition associated with trying to forage through the documentation that's necessary for that. It's important to recognize the ability to use tools and process and be a little bit more automated about that, possibly. And avoid some of the intensive nature of the conservative approach. It's also risk prohibitive. The conservative approach doesn't really take into account the streamlining, the positive streamlining approach that comes from looking at going through the 3 phases we now know as process design, operational qualification, and finally process control, or product and process control. So in this sense, now we have the new organization, the IMDRF, or the International Medical Device Regulatory Forum, has continued to promote documentation that give examples of the process that should be used, including those that we know are not verifiable, where validation is absolute, and it's important to understand the risk component and the basis for good engineering design practice approach for these processes, such as sterilization, aseptic filling technique, sterile packaging, lyophilization, heat treating, the plating process in plastic injection molding. All of these are very important from a validation mode. But if we use the new guidance and we understand it, it becomes much more effective because of the risk-based approach. So of course, validation, process validation never dies. We're talking about the development in the draft form from the FDA that talked about the life cycle approach to process validation, and then of course the new document relative to the general principles and practices into place as explicit conditions for process validation. We need to recognize by virtue of the new document that validation is now, because it is a life cycle approach, it's ongoing, not complete and put away. I travel and I audit and I see organizations that have validation documents that are older than the people who are presenting them to me. That's scary. These are documents that really, at some point, no longer provide any value in the understanding of ongoing continuous validation control in the form of revalidation or trigger points in the understanding of control where a validation should occur in the form of a revalidation if for no other reason it's simply outdated. The importance that it does in necessitating the comprehensive nature of process design. So the sourcing design condition, understanding the variability in that condition, and then of course achieving the process understanding relative to process validation, and how you convey from process design over to process control. And of course the practical incorporation of the risk management aspect, or risk management in terms of the use of good tools as a part of this process. We also need to recognize that more knowledge is going to be gained during the commercialization component of this process validation cycle, and it's imperative that the understanding and application of the rear end of this process relative to commercialization is just as much a part of process design as the process design itself, in terms of where it fits into the design control phase gate process. Of course, the other thing is that this is only as successful as the data and how it is used and applied is possible, wherever possible, in this process. So what I'm talking about here is a plan, a measurement plan during the process design application. So you are actually looking at very specific statistically representative sampling and empirical data as a result of this. So, and I might also add, from a statistical standpoint, it is just as healthy to have variable statistical data as it is to have attribute-driven statistical data. Those things that will translate from product to process attributes in control that eventually become part of the process control aspect of ongoing verification of product. And of course, the one thing we cannot avoid is that GMP, in terms of this requirement, will always be enforceable. So it's important to be very clear when validation must occur, and that we use the new validation process to incorporate risk, to incorporate data, and to be more robust relative to the process design aspect and consideration of our product in the process. So, there's lots of good examples here in this particular slide as we talk about the force field analysis or comparison between verification and validation. But I want to focus on the second line item in this graphic to say it's important to understand the difference between verification and did we design it right versus our validation and did we design the right thing. So understanding the difference between those two is very important as we look at the means for process control as it relates to process design and how we may have validated or created statistical specifications in control of our product. So to validate or not to validate, this is the question. And it's important to understand how basic this is, but how important it is as we look to process validation in the new sense and its application. So first of all is a process and its outputs. Are they verifiable? If in fact they are verifiable, you have the ability to do that, then is it sufficient and cost effective to apply verification? If so, then of course we look at process control from a verification standpoint. But even still, as we understand that, our ability to look at process design from a validation standpoint gives us some understanding around tools and processes that help support that. So if we are looking again at process output as verifiable and we cannot do that, are we looking at a redesign application relative to product or process, or are we simply genuinely in a condition that we need to validate the right thing that we're doing and that we are able to understand its ability to be controlled or control the process so that we don't need to verify it by data that can only come from the output of the process. Okay, so process understanding in terms of validation, the focus is on process understanding. So the question is, can we provide an alternative effective mechanism in which we achieve validation with a high degree of assurance, quality assurance? And therein lies the importance of translating the design of the process as it relates to what we affectionately know as a device master record and the control planning that goes into that. Process validation can be enhanced and consistent relative to it being a high degree of quality assurance where the process itself is continually monitored and evaluated so that we may look at possible adjustments using the validated in-process measurements, controls, and of course endpoints in a closed-loop fashion. So a process then is predictable using these validated process design controls that now become the essence of the ongoing capability of the process that we have validated. So the confidence we have in such planning then gains benefits for looking at the conventional process validation where we're looking at qualification and change control as the ultimate design for reducing regulatory oversight because of the high degree of confidence that comes from the application of this new process. Okay, so let's step back just for a second and talk structure. When we're talking about structure, we have to talk about process design. And we have to talk about process design in the context of design control. So from a new product development standpoint, you know, we're talking about the importance of the stage gate cause and effect relative to the white spaces that occur in between each one of these phases. And it's important to recognize as you look at this diagram that there are two important components to it. One is that the necessity of having reviews where you drop down information that becomes the important components for what I call the white spacing in this graphic. And the white spacing meaning between each phase gate, those decisions, planning conditions relative to risk, and application in terms of process design have to be looked at from a critical thinking orientation. So outputs relative to good critical thinking should be the design for improvement relative to looking at design control. Okay, so we're talking about basically the strategic marketing and planning aspect on the left-hand side of this flow, and then we're talking about the importance of communications from outputs as you progress for process design purposes immediate to launch. So that operational qualification is just the means to look at those process design conditions in their application to process and product control. Now, simple diagram here for understanding, what kind of triggers we look at as we talk about a validation project as it relates to our process. So you have new, or you have change, or you have failure conditions for looking at, as we come down on each one, those documentation items that are important in the process, in the total robust process design as we look at the production of product. One of the things I want to focus in on this particular graphic is the importance that computer system control we take into account that particular aspect of the process now as we know that validation to software programs in medical device have become a very important aspect as computer system technology starts to replace those things in process control for making decisions that are done analytically within the software as opposed to the human factor element in which it's replacing. And of course on the last line relative to this table you see that we have three different considerations that we're looking at in terms of new, change, and failure conditions being if it's new it could be a manufacturing site or manufacturing area. In terms of changes that we understand, are there infrastructure, facility conditions? Could it be the application or integration of software with hardware, firmware relative to the process? Or could it be a full system upgrade that could have significant implications for process control? Now, as we look at risk in this process, we talk about risk-based verification, meaning that we understand the flow from left to right for good engineering practices, but on the left-hand side, we have to recognize some very important concepts that have to be in place in order for process design as the first phase to be acceptable. Those, of course, being, do we have good product knowledge? Do we have good process knowledge? Do we have a good understanding of the regulatory aspects of those components? And of course, do we have a healthy organizational quality component with the appropriate resources to take those things into account as we inject them in through the design control process. So as we move from left to right, it's important for each one of those phases for us to understand that risk management is very important in terms of its application, either by a tool like a failure mode effect analysis or an assessment condition where we may be looking at a risk matrix qualitatively relative to hazards as we translate from hazard to harm to risk. Also, are we looking at understanding the importance that change management will play in its appropriate role relative to this process, going from concept to design and development to verification, validation, to product freeze, launch, and change control as it moves into continual improvement relative to process control versus process design in this process, in this approach. So I mentioned earlier the white space. The white space is important because if you look at this graphic where there are points where the arrows are moving from left to right in terms of the nature of those contributors to the final outcome, which is the use of the product in the environment, in the clinical environment. Those white spaces are represented by any one of these arrows moving from left to right, where you basically have three different aspects of critical thinking that apply. First is, as we tackle issues or issues are raised and we have to deal with them, are we dealing with them properly from a risk perspective in terms of the nature of urgency, the significance of impact, and the timing associated with them, in terms of what our next steps are in either resolving, decision-making, or planning for implementation and success of that implementation in those white spaces between those activity conditions. So while design control relative to process control, relative to testing and distribution may seem pretty straightforward, anything can go awry relative to these decision points or condition points in the white spaces between these processes. And how we handle that really boils down to good empirical data and good critical thinking. That's where the reliability and repeatability comes into play from a process model approach. Of course, we have the importance of understanding that this is all going on in a PDCA or closed-looped application relative to the quality system. So we have to understand, in this case, what's happening now with the dynamics of the convergence of standards as well as the guidelines that are helping that convergence. So is the 13485 2016 document is now out that replaces the 2003 and 2012 documents that for 13485 with the entitlements relative to the explicit conditions that come out of the quality system standard and its influence on very specific product-related standards like the one for medical device, regulatory purpose for medical device under 13485. And of course, inputs and outputs, again, think in terms of process design across multiple processes within a quality system approach. Look at integration between activities within processes to understand the risks associated with communication and information through an integrated approach with regard to every one of the processes that are within the quality system model. Case in point, here you have the new Plan, Do, Check, Act orientation of the 9001 2015 standard, and you'll see many different titles that are new to us as we understand the importance that each one of these PDCA components work. So this high-level system has this PDCA approach and then explicit components within it, such as the ability to analyze risk and opportunity analysis, has now escalated itself to a formal component within the system. Rearrangement of conditions relative to the use and applications, such as management review, now being under continual improvement as a component, and you'll see it sits just adjacent to the internal audit process in how we validate processes for process design purposes in a quality system. Specifically now around the white space concept is the importance of planning for risks. And so the model you have in front of you here is the kind of the standard quality understanding for emphasis relative to a risk in the model for looking at the probability of a condition versus its impact in terms of consequences. And of course the descriptors we're looking at here are fairly basic, but it's important to focus. If I look at, for instance, a low impact and a low probability on the lower right-hand corner, I may have an acceptable risk. Relative to the control measures that may be associated with the nature of probability and thereby reducing it. On the other hand, if I look at the extensive management and crucial involvement in the upper right-hand corner, we're talking about immediate exposure in terms of probability and impact, and that the activity associated with that should be commensurate to that risk. How do we translate understanding the control of risk as it relates to the full realm of opportunities and understanding their interaction in control of risk? So this graphic then basically it boils down to change control, management of change in the center, in our ability to first measure it, and then look at what we all know as the 6M approach, which is typically used in a cause and effect analysis, where you have measurement, materials, manpower, Mother Nature, methods, and equipment or machines. And all of these create situational conditions that we need to make sure we understand in order to have the level of control necessary to deal with risk. So in terms of the actual process validation guideline, what we have here for your reference is each phase of that guideline as it relates to the process, going from process design to process qualification or operational qualification, and then finally continual process verification or process control as we know it. In regulatory terms, it's affectionately known as P and PC, product and process control, which, by the way, if you look at infractions on an annual basis for the year 2014 to 15 data, that's the latest available information, we're talking about an item for infraction purposes that is the leading infraction by the FDA around investigations for product in the medical device field. Okay, on the heels of that, of course, is our affectionate CAPA, or corrective and preventive action, that we know and understand, or at least we should, but by reference to infractions relative to investigations from a regulatory standpoint, it sits right there on the heels of PMPC when we're looking at the big picture, the overall picture of, one, how we control it, and two, how we take care of change control or management of change as a result of that, and or i.e. CAPA in that orientation. So this diagram moves from left to right, where we're talking about the steps, then we're talking about understanding the conditions of why, we're talking about typical things that we need to consider for actions related to each process phase, and then of course the type of tools that would be oriented in their use for each one of the phases of process validation. Okay, assumptive normality. I think anybody who's had any exposure to the engineering of product from a design consideration, and more importantly, being a manufacturer or being someone responsible for major aspects of manufacturing, we typically, and unfortunately, love to use what's called assumptive normality, which is simply this: I'm too busy to run my product. Don't bother me with the fact that I do or don't understand the level of control I actually have in my process. That's ludicrous. And so it's important for us to realize or recognize the absurdity around assumptive normality, or making the assumption that my process has a normal curve in terms of its ability to be controlled, so that the data is actually there that helps me to predict this. You're right, it should be there to help you predict it. You should not be making assumptions around the fact that your process is operating normally about a center line or a center point in terms of process design. So as we look at stability, you know, that in terms of data, that's what it's all about. So knowing, first of all, what sensitive variables or attributes are we looking at? Are they the right touch points for keeping control of our process as you look from the unstable side on the left to the stable process on the right? Once you have your ducks in a row, or in this case, your peaks in a row, you can understand the ability to shift or move something for control purposes and how it affects the other variables in your system. On the left-hand side, you have, unfortunately, what is reality for a process in its operation, and yet the assumptive normality is to the right, that my process looks like what's on the right, when in fact it looks like the one on the left. So how do I, when I look at this from a validity standpoint and risk, I'm back to my 6 M's in terms of really knowing those things that provide value in my ability to get rid of that assumption and to begin to understand the level of control I actually have. And of course, where I don't have that control, I have risk. So I need to either be willing to accept that risk on the basis of not controlling it, or having some form of management of change around it, so that I can then move to the next level in this representation, where I'm not necessarily capable, but at least I have normality. And then I move from not capable to capable by looking at successful process qualification based on design and ultimately control. So what we're talking about here then is going from normality, understanding and recognizing it in terms of empirical data and the use of statistical tools, stability in terms of my understanding of the interaction of components within my process, and process qualification as it goes from step 1 to step N relative to my outputs, and then of course capability in terms of my understanding in process qualification. How much capability do I have for control based on the way my process has been designed? Now, in order for that to matter, it's important for us to look at this graphic and really know that there are so many possibilities for cause and effect relationships in my process, that the qualification around that process, the analysis for data in process qualification, tells me that I have cause and effect relationships of significant variables or attributes, and that's what this graphic represents. So my relationship between inputs and outputs should be understood in terms of all of the components within design of my process. For instance, movement from lot to lot in a raw material during the course of a run. The ability to adjust variables for fine-tuning purposes. As we know, one of the famous statistical exposures relative to process when we look at operational control by the person who's responsible for that process is what we call sawtoothing. And that's a statistical term where we look at a graph and we see the process going like the teeth in the mouth of a shark, okay, or sawtoothing when we're talking about lack of control, because our ability to try and control is to simply adjust back and forth, and when we really should be allowing the process to do its thing and then fine-tune that process for good random data. But it's important here to understand that if I don't have good control in terms of understanding random data, then I don't have two curves that represent normality in order for me to understand that if I do make a change, then I understand the latitude of that change relative to other variables that I'm looking at for process qualification. Do I have any data tools at my fingertips to understand that? This list, if you can't find it in this list to understand all the possibilities for applying what we've referred to as phase 2 process qualification for data output and its use to qualify process design, then we simply are doing a major disservice in creating very high risk around our process by not using these tools and using the empirical data necessary to crunch through these tools. And you may notice that it's not just the statistical data, such as statistical measurement system analysis under gauge R&R studies, or looking at challenge testing based on what we refer to as the cookbook condition for testing variances in our system and using a method for testing those. So you know, there's all sorts of possibilities here that we can look at as the means to make adjustments for process qualification and to see what the output or outcome is of that, and does it make sense from a process standpoint that we can actually control our process. So of course we know from a regulatory standpoint what the regs say under Section 75 of QSR 820. Item A talks about where results of a process cannot be verified. It's important that the validation have a high degree of assurance and is approved according to the established procedures around validation. Now, if I don't use the process validation guideline and I therefore do not use good process design, process qualification, and process outputs relative to control, then what am I doing? If I'm using IQ, OQ, PQ, I'm doing a great disservice because it's disjointed. There's no allowance and understanding for cause and effect with regard to risk and variables and attributes within the process, and that I can save a lot of time and grief on the process design aspect of the first phase to move directly to verifiable or conditions of control based on understanding risk in process and product control. And of course, the key component in the center there is then process qualification. So the deep dive on the reg, basically in essence, the requirement is stating that for some processes, inspection alone, of course, is not sufficient. Particularly true when we're looking at a defect that basically doesn't become apparent or manifest itself until the product's out in the field or we've done final product release. It could be because verification simply is impossible. Okay, so in terms of it not being sufficient, may require very costly destructive testing, which we would want to avoid for cost purposes. So as we look at the GMP rule as it relates to this, the importance of the regulation is that it states that process validation is established by objective evidence that a process consistently produces a result of product, meeting its predetermined specifications. We're talking about good critical thinking as it relates to good decision making around understanding that if our objective is this, then our criteria must follow and they must be objective. And then based on those criteria, we must look at the alternatives in our process design application. Then to that part of it, we have to look at risk and the application of risk to understand what controls need to be in place for process control and process capability. We do that in the process qualification step. In doing this then, we see what's required when we're trying to understand the source of variation, the ability to reduce and control that variation, and the establishment of a process that is capable. And, of course, will show consistently that it can meet a specification. Now, when we say meet a specification, we're talking about all those things that relate to statistically understanding, cause and effect understanding, and decision-making understanding around acceptance of criteria that we determine in using those criteria to eventually become product and process control conditions. So this thing that I've just been talking about, I refer to as a diamond in the rough. That diamond, of course, being identifying critical control points relative to decisions that are made based on data. and not based on assumptive normality. So the purpose of process validation is not so much those things relative to automatic control or assumptive normality, but the actual demonstration so you know that process capability is significant relative to the process. As I go back to those bell curves and the positioning, the narrowing of the bell curve relative to process capability around a specification, and then making these decisions based on risk to improve that. So as we kind of wrap up on this concept of design, process design to qualification to control, it's important to recognize that there are certain things that are significant inputs on the process design side, such as flow diagramming, FMEA analysis. Do we have special characteristics relative to inputs? Do we have lessons learned on similar products with similar circumstances, or similar raw materials as it relates to processes, or people and their training as a resource as it relates to that process? So team planning in terms of understanding the level of control and human factors is a very important part of risk as it relates to process design. And then, of course, design reviews themselves in terms of optimizing inputs and outputs in those reviews within the phases of process design control. The output then is control planning. Control planning in the sense that you have a document that basically provides a level of control understanding in terms of the methods, the control within those methods, the understanding of moving over across failure mode understandings and prioritization of improvement. All that comes into the control planning so that, of course, the outputs then become strong methods with validated equipment and validated utensils, and of course data that is used by the operator under the circumstance of process control live relative to the product. Here we have an example of the control plan where you are actually translating control methodology from a failure mode standpoint and the effect relative to actions, and then those actions are translated down into a control plan for looking at specifics that actually become the predecessor for the DMR, or the device master record. So it's very possible that you could see a control planning condition as a component of a device master record in understanding the nature of control necessary from process design. So here is an example. We have the model that comes from the ad hoc working group, the top level working group now within the IMDRF, and across this model, understanding the important influences that each role plays in the quality system as it functions in its ability to affect process validation. So, cart before the horse, we're talking about understanding various components of structure and the timing of those components as it relates to developing this approach. First, of course, of which is the proactive, prospective condition for validation, where we're looking at variables that may contain risk and how we put control measures in place for them. Versus concurrent, where you're actually in operational mode, you're using statistical data to understand relationships of variable to variable, or attribute to variable, or attribute to attribute, and you're using process data, process lot data, to come up with justification for control as a part of using that in process design. In the case of retrospective, we're talking about past tense We have a completed developed design history file for information. We have, of course, an approval submission relative to the aspect of the product from the regulators. Then we also have then lot data, historical lot data. So it may be necessary to do a retrospective build in understanding an application of process design if you're not familiar or if you're new to process validation in its new context. And of course, the revalidation, we're talking about understanding trigger points in procedure for the rationale behind why we would ask certain things that would trigger the need for additional or upgraded validation conditions. So in terms of process, product and process control, when we're looking at principles and tools, we're talking about those things that, of course, support innovatively improvement around process design. So the example of multivariate tools for design, where your data acquisition analysis of concurrent data. We're talking about process analyzers where we're looking at simulation techniques. The process control tools themselves relative to what the application is of those tools in process and the outputs from them. The continuous improvement and knowledge management relative to these tools, and I refer specifically to understanding the efficiency and effectiveness of good critical thinking relative to inputs and outputs. Scientific principles, of course, the risk-based approach is absolutely imperative. Taking a risk-based approach means embedding at the practical level the use and understanding of the risk matrix or failure mode condition or fault tree condition, whatever that tool is, using those tools for a risk-based approach. Making sure your system is integrated, what does that mean in terms of either integrated systems or processes within a system? The need for real-time release data so that we have some means to gather data and have it set up to empirically but statistically give us trend capability, cycle capability, or issue resolution conditions based on data. And of course, the appropriate combination in terms of some or all can be applied to a single unit operation, more than one unit operation, or an entire process from looking at the inputs with regard to supplier control all the way through to the post-market surveillance aspect of your product. So, to wrap this up, what we're talking about then is what is referred to as quality by design, or what I call quality by risk, and the combination of the two in providing parameters, controls, and conditions under which we put in place, based on process design, control capability that is either preventive in nature or mitigative, depending upon the controls that need to be in place for consequences if in fact we're dealing with an issue that is going to be imminent relative to our process. So this model is basically telling us in a continual improvement approach how we're looking at the central condition of the role that quality by design plays in the first phase of process validation, process design, the qualification relative to that design and the nature of how we look at risk as well as capability, and then the final controls which have included in them not just the ability to adjust for control purposes, but actions to take when we feel that it's necessary based on risk to apply those conditions that we have designed in process design relative to looking at failure modes or control conditions and worst case, but important, the closed cycle condition back to process design, either based on post-market surveillance or data relative to lot-by-lot condition for using this process, and the reviews for making good decisions under critical thinking for good outcomes. So we do the math. We're talking about the stability of the 6M influencers relative to cause and effect, plus the predictability in our nature to validate through process qualification should equal our reproducibility condition based on verification of control conditions. This concludes our discussion around process validation, especially in the context of the 2011 guideline by the FDA. So I want you to know that you can find these slides or get these slides at mastercontrol.com. The slides then will provide you with useful takeaways to understand and consider for application of this 21st century model that is now being used explicitly as part of the quality management system. Thank you very much.